The sun beat down hard on the streets of Riverside that Thursday afternoon, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the pavement. Most people were inside, hiding from the summer warmth in air-conditioned buildings, but 17-year-old Letitia Johnson didn't have that choice. She was walking home from her job at the local library, her backpack heavy with books she borrowed for her upcoming history project. Letitia loved her jog-shelving books and helping younger kids find stories during reading hour. The library staff treated her well, and the extra money helped her save for college. She had big dreams of becoming a lawyer someday, something her mother had always encouraged. "You keep your head in those books," her mom would say. "That mind of yours is going to take you places." As Letitia walked through Parkview Heights, she pulled out her water bottle for a quick sip. This neighborhood always made her a bit nervous. The houses were bigger here, with perfect green lawns and expensive cars in the driveways. People sometimes stared when she walked through, but it cut 15 minutes off her walk home, and in this heat, that mattered. She was passing a blue house with white trim when she noticed a police car slowly driving down the street. Letitia didn't think much of it at first. Police patrolled everywhere in the city. But then the car slowed down even more as it approached her. The officer inside was watching her closely. The police car suddenly pulled up to the curb right in front of her. The door swung open, and Officer James Blackwood stepped out. He was tall with broad shoulders, his uniform crisp despite the heat. His face was set in a hard expression that made Letitia's stomach tighten with worry. "Stop right there," Officer Blackwood called out, his hand already resting on his belt. "Let me see some ID." Letitia stopped walking, confused but not particularly alarmed yet. This had happened before to her and her friends. "I'm just walking home from work, sir," she explained calmly, reaching slowly for her wallet in her back pocket. "I work at the library on Main Street." Officer Blackwood moved closer, his stance wide and intimidating. "We got a call about someone suspicious in the neighborhood. You matched the description." Letitia's heart began to beat faster, but she kept her voice steady like her mother had taught her. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just walking home." "I'll decide that," the officer snapped. Before Letitia could show her library ID badge, Officer Blackwood grabbed her arm roughly, spinning her around. "Hands on the car," he ordered, his voice rising. "But I haven't done anything," Letitia protested, her voice shaking now. "I'm just a student walking home from work." The officer wasn't listening. He pushed her against the hot police car and started roughly searching her backpack, dumping her carefully organized books and notes onto the ground. Her water bottle rolled into the street, spilling across the hot pavement. "Please, those are library books," Letitia said, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll have to pay for them if they're damaged." "Should have thought about that before causing trouble," Officer Blackwood muttered, though Letitia still had no idea what trouble he was talking about. What neither of them realized was that eyes were watching from the surrounding houses. Mrs. Rivera, a retired judge who lived in the Blue House, had come to her window when she heard the officer's harsh voice. She stood there now, her cell phone raised, recording everything. Across the street, Mr. Lee had stepped onto his porch, also filming the scene unfolding before him. As Officer Blackwood twisted Letitia's arm behind her back to place handcuffs on her wrists, she cried out in pain. "You're hurting me. Please, I haven't done anything wrong." "Stop resisting," the officer growled, though Letitia was clearly not fighting back. Mr. Lee couldn't stay silent anymore. "Hey, what are you doing to that girl?" he called out, walking down his driveway. "She walks through here all the time after her library shift. She's not causing any trouble." The officer looked up, suddenly aware he had an audience. Several other neighbors had come outside now, phones in hand. Mrs. Rivera had already posted her video to social media, where it was beginning to spread like wildfire. Officer Blackwood hesitated, clearly not expecting witnesses. His radio crackled with a dispatcher's voice, describing a suspect in a completely different part of town. He had the wrong person in the wrong place, and now there were too many people watching. Little did Officer Blackwood know that his actions in the next few minutes would not only change Letitia's life forever, but would also end his 12-year career in law enforcement and spark a movement that would transform the entire Riverside Police Department. The videos were already spreading across town, and soon, the whole country would know Letitia Johnson's name. Mrs. Rivera's hands shook as she continued filming from her window. At 68 years old, the retired judge had seen plenty of injustice in her career, but watching it happen right outside her home felt different. More personal, more urgent. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself, making sure her phone captured every detail. 40 years on the bench had taught her exactly what proper police procedure looked like, and this wasn't it. Across the street, Mr. Lee, a high school science teacher, had already started live-streaming the incident on his social media account. He'd recognized Letitia from the community center where he volunteered on weekends. She was always polite, always helping the younger kids with their homework. "I'm getting this all on video, officer," Mr. Lee called out, wanting to make sure Officer Blackwood knew his actions weren't going unnoticed. "The whole neighborhood knows this girl walks through here after work." More neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Patel came out with her phone already recording. Mr. Washington, a tall man in his 40s, stepped off his porch and walked closer, his presence alone making a statement. Officer Blackwood's demeanor changed slightly when he realized how many people were watching, how many cameras were pointed his way. He loosened his grip on Letitia's arm but didn't let go. "This is police business," he announced loudly. "Everyone needs to step back." But the neighbors didn't move. Instead, more joined them. "I'm a retired judge," Mrs. Rivera called out as she walked down her front steps, phone still recording. "And I can tell you that what you're doing is a clear violation of this young woman's civil rights. You have no probable cause for this detention." Letitia stood trembling against the police car, tears streaming down her face. She'd never been in trouble before, not once in her life. Her mother had raised her to respect authority, to work hard, to stay out of situations exactly like this one. "Please," she said quietly, "call my mom. She can tell you I was at work. My boss at the library can confirm it too." Mrs. Rivera approached carefully. "Young lady, don't say anything more without a lawyer present. Officer, I'm going to have to insist you remove those handcuffs immediately." Officer Blackwood's face reddened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by civilians. "Ma'am, please step back. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Mr. Washington said firmly. "That's somebody's daughter you're treating like a criminal for no reason." Mr. Lee's livestream was already gathering viewers. Comments poured in by the second, the number of people watching climbing rapidly. Someone recognized Letitia from the library and posted her name in the comments. Someone else tagged local news stations. Mrs. Patel, who ran the corner store 3 blocks away, stepped forward. "I see this girl walk to and from the library almost every day. She buys a bottle of water from my shop sometimes. She's a good kid." The officer's radio crackled again. A voice came through asking for his status. Blackwood hesitated, then responded that he was handling a situation in Parkview Heights. The radio crackled back. "Be advised, suspect in the break-in was apprehended on Elm Street. White male, approximately 30 years old." The neighbors exchanged glances. Mrs. Rivera raised an eyebrow. "It seems your suspect has been caught elsewhere, officer. Now will you please release this young woman?" Officer Blackwood's jaw tightened. He was trapped now, by witnesses, by cameras, by his own mistake. Slowly, reluctantly, he removed the handcuffs from Letitia's wrists. "You're free to go," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "But stay out of trouble." Letitia rubbed her sore wrists, tears still falling. "I wasn't in any trouble until you put me there," she said softly. Mrs. Rivera put a gentle arm around the girl's shoulders. "It's all right now. Let's collect your things." Together, they gathered the books and papers scattered on the ground. Some had landed in a puddle from her spilled water bottle, the pages now warped and stained. "The library will charge me for these," Letitia said, her voice breaking as she held up a damaged history book. "No, they won't," Mrs. Rivera assured her. "I'll make sure of it." As Officer Blackwood got back in his patrol car, Mr. Lee made sure to capture his badge number clearly on the livestream. The officer drove away, but the damage was already done. Within an hour, the video had been shared thousands of times. Local news stations were calling witnesses for statements. Letitia's mother, frantic after seeing her daughter's face on social media, rushed to Mrs. Rivera's house where Letitia was resting. By nightfall, the story had reached national news. What Officer Blackwood didn't know was that his 12 years on the force were about to come to an abrupt end. and it had all been captured on camera for the world to see. By morning, Letitia's name was everywhere. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications, messages from friends, and calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Her mother, Mrs. Johnson, unplugged the house phone after the 5th news station called asking for a statement. "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to," she told Letitia, sitting on the edge of her daughter's bed. "Not a single person." Letitia nodded, her eyes still puffy from crying most of the night. The red marks on her wrists had faded to dull bruises, physical reminders of what had happened. But the feeling of being pushed against that hot police car, of being treated like a criminal when she'd done nothing wrong, that feeling hadn't faded at all. "People keep tagging me in the videos," Letitia whispered. "I don't want to watch them, but I can't stop myself." Her mother took her hand gently. "Then we turn off the phone for a while. This isn't something you need to relive over and over." Outside their modest 2-bedroom apartment, a crowd was gathering. Not just reporters with their cameras and microphones, but neighbors, classmates, and complete strangers holding handmade signs. "Justice for Letitia. Black Girls Matter. Hold police accountable." Mrs. Johnson peeked through the blinds and shook her head. "I never wanted this kind of attention for you." "I never wanted it either, Mom," Letitia said, "but maybe it happened for a reason." By noon, the crowd outside the Riverside Police Department had grown to hundreds. People from all walks of life stood shoulder to shoulder in the summer heat. An older man passed out water bottles. A group of mothers formed a prayer circle. Teenagers Letitia's age led chants through megaphones. Inside the station, Police Chief Diana Rodriguez watched the growing protest from her office window. On her desk sat printouts of the videos, still images showing Officer Blackwood's actions from multiple angles. Next to them was Blackwood's personnel file, thicker than it should have been for an officer with his years of service. The chief's assistant knocked on her door. "Ma'am, the mayor's on line 1. And there are reporters in the lobby demanding a statement." Chief Rodriguez nodded. "Tell the mayor I'll call him back in 10 minutes. And inform the press I'll make a statement at 2 p.m. After the assistant left, Rodriguez opened Blackwood's file again. There it was, the pattern she'd been afraid she'd find. Complaints that had been filed and then seemingly vanished. Reports with inconsistencies that nobody had questioned. Notes from supervisors that hinted at problems but never directly addressed them. The system had failed, and now a 17-year-old girl was paying the price. At 2 p.m. sharp, Chief Rodriguez stepped outside to face the crowd and the wall of cameras. She'd worn her full uniform, every button fastened, her badge polished to a shine. This wasn't about looking good for the cameras. This was about representing what the police department was supposed to stand for. Yesterday afternoon, an incident occurred in Parkview Heights involving one of our officers and a young member of our community, she began, her voice firm and clear. "I have reviewed the footage captured by witnesses, and I am deeply disturbed by what I saw." The crowd quieted, hanging on her every word. Effective immediately, Officer James Blackwood has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I want to be clear. What happened yesterday does not represent the values or training of the Riverside Police Department. A reporter shouted out, "Will Officer Blackwood face criminal charges?" "That will depend on the findings of our internal affairs investigation, which I have personally ordered to be expedited," Chief Rodriguez answered. "I have also reached out to the district attorney's office for an independent review of the case." Back at the Johnson apartment, Letitia and her mother watched the press conference on TV. When the chief said Letitia's name, apologizing directly to her and her family, Letitia felt something shift inside her. For the first time since the incident, she felt like someone in power actually saw her, not as a problem, not as a suspect, but as a person who deserved justice. The chief's final words seemed to speak directly to her. To Miss Johnson, "What happened to you was wrong. You deserve better from those sworn to protect this community. And I promise you will see action, not just words, in response to this incident." As the press conference ended, Letitia's phone rang. It was Mrs. Rivera, the retired judge who had stepped in to help her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Mrs. Rivera said when Letitia answered. "I just wanted to check how you're doing." "I'm okay," Letitia said, surprising herself because it felt partly true. The chief just gave a press conference. I saw, but that's just the beginning, Mrs. Rivera told her. Listen, I have some connections with civil rights attorneys in the city. People who can make sure your voice is heard in all this. Would you and your mother be willing to meet with one of them? Letitia looked at her mom, who had been listening. Mrs. Johnson nodded. Yes, Letitia said. I think we would. By nightfall, the hashtag Justice for Letitia was trending nationwide. What had started as a local incident was becoming something much bigger, a movement for accountability that would soon reach all the way to Officer Blackwood's front door. The Internal Affairs Office at the Riverside Police Department hadn't been this busy in years. Lieutenant Thomas Wong, head of the division, had called in his entire team to work through the weekend. Files covered every surface of the conference room where they had set up headquarters for the investigation. I want everything, Wong told his team. Every complaint, every report, every scrap of paper with Blackwood's name on it. Lieutenant Wong had been with Internal Affairs for 8 years. He'd seen his share of problem officers, but something about this case felt different. The public outrage, the clear video evidence, the straightforward nature of the wrongdoing, there was nowhere to hide on this one. A young officer knocked on the doorframe. Sir, I think I found something you should see. She handed him a folder containing complaint forms dating back 3 years, all filed against Officer Blackwood, all from people of color, all mysteriously marked resolved with no disciplinary action. Who signed off on these? Wong asked, flipping through them. That's the interesting part, the officer replied. It was Lieutenant Harris. He retired last year. Wong leaned back in his chair. Harris had been Blackwood's direct supervisor for years. The two had also been friends outside of work, fishing trips, backyard barbecues. Their kids played on the same sports teams. Find me every case where Harris signed off on Blackwood's conduct, Wong said, and get me the phone numbers of everyone who filed these complaints. It's time we heard their stories. Across town, Officer Blackwood sat at his kitchen table, staring at his silent phone. No calls from fellow officers, no messages of support, just silence. His wife moved around the house quietly, as if afraid to disturb him. They're hanging me out to dry, he finally said. 12 years on the force, and they're throwing me to the wolves over one mistake. His wife didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was tight. I saw the video, Jim. Everyone has. That wasn't just a mistake. You don't understand what it's like out there, he shot back. Split-second decisions. You weren't there. No, but 20 neighbors with cell phones were. She sat down across from him. And I've known you long enough to know when you're not telling the whole truth. Before he could respond, a news alert popped up on his phone. The police department had scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning. Rumor had it that more officers were coming forward with information about past incidents. Blackwood felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. Meanwhile, at Mrs. Rivera's comfortable home in Parkview Heights, Letitia and her mother sat in the living room with attorney David Chen, one of the city's most respected civil rights lawyers. What happened to you wasn't an isolated incident, Chen explained, spreading out papers on the coffee table. We've already heard from 5 other young people who had similar experiences with Officer Blackwood. None of their complaints ever went anywhere. Letitia's mother leaned forward. So what does that mean for my daughter's case? It means there's a pattern, Chen said. And patterns are powerful evidence, both in civil suits and criminal proceedings. Mrs. Rivera brought in a tray with lemonade and cookies. David has already spoken with the district attorney, she explained as she poured drinks. They're taking this very seriously. Letitia had been quiet listening. Finally, she asked, What do you need from me? Chen smiled gently. Your story, in your own words. I know it's hard to relive it, but your voice matters most in all of this. Letitia took a deep breath. I can do that, but I want something in return. Everyone looked at her with surprise. I want to make sure this doesn't just end with one officer, she said firmly. Something's wrong with the whole system if all those other complaints were ignored. That needs to change too. Chen nodded with newfound respect. You're absolutely right. And that's exactly the kind of case I want to build. Back at the police department, Chief Rodriguez was having a difficult conversation with the mayor. The press is going to ask if we're pursuing criminal charges, the mayor said. What's your answer going to be? The truth, Rodriguez replied. That we're working closely with the DA's office and that no option is off the table. The mayor sighed. This could tear the department apart. Officers don't like to see one of their own facing criminal charges. With all due respect, sir, what tears departments apart is allowing bad officers to stay on the force when everyone knows they're bad officers. Rodriguez's voice was firm. The good cops, and there are many, they deserve better colleagues. The public deserves better protection. After a moment, the mayor nodded. You're right. Just make sure you have all your ducks in a row before that press conference. This is going to get messy. As night fell over Riverside, Lieutenant Wong was still at his desk, reading through old reports. His phone rang. It was one of his investigators. Sir, you need to see this. We found body cam footage from Blackwood's patrol car, from 6 different incidents. All of them were supposedly uploaded to the system, but someone changed the file names so they couldn't be easily found in searches. Wong sat up straight. Who had access to change those file names? That's just it, sir. Only 2 people, Blackwood himself and Lieutenant Harris. Wong closed his eyes briefly. This was bigger than one officer now. This was a cover-up. Secure that footage, he ordered. Don't let anyone know we found it yet. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The investigation had just taken a turn that would shock the entire department and possibly send a decorated police officer to jail. The hidden videos changed everything. Lieutenant Wong sat in a darkened room, his face lit only by the glow of the monitor as he watched footage after footage. With each new video, the knot in his stomach tightened. There was no mistaking the pattern. Officer Blackwood had been targeting young people of color for years, and someone had helped hide the evidence. Wong rubbed his tired eyes. It was nearly midnight, but he couldn't stop watching. These weren't just policy violations. These were crimes committed with a badge and a gun. A knock at the door made him look up. Officer Tanya Reynolds, one of his most trusted team members, entered with a tray of coffee. You should see this one, Wong said, pointing to the screen. From last October, Blackwood detained a 16-year-old boy walking home from basketball practice. Claimed he matched the description of a robbery suspect, but listened to the radio call before he stopped him. He turned up the volume. The dispatcher's voice was clear. Suspect is a white male, approximately 30, with a neck tattoo. Reynolds shook her head. The boy in the video isn't white, isn't 30, and doesn't have any tattoos. Exactly. And look who shows up to help. One paused the video as another patrol car pulled up. A second officer stepped out, Lieutenant Harris. They were working together, Reynolds said quietly. Not just working together. Harris was teaching him. Wong leaned back in his chair. I checked the shift schedules. Harris requested Blackwood be assigned to his patrol sector for almost 2 years. He was mentoring him. More like grooming him, Reynolds said, creating another cop who would uphold the blue wall of silence. Wong nodded grimly. We need to bring this to the chief, first thing tomorrow. Across town, Officer Blackwood couldn't sleep. He paced his living room, phone in hand, trying to reach his old mentor. Pick up Harris, he muttered as the phone rang. Come on, man. Finally, a gruff voice answered. Do you know what time it is? They're on to us, Blackwood said without preamble. Internal Affairs has been pulling my old files. They called in people I've arrested to take new statements. A long silence. Then, what exactly did you do to that girl, Jim? The one all over the news. Nothing I haven't done 100 times before. The same stuff you taught me, assertive policing, maintaining control of the situation. The only difference is some nosy neighbors decided to play filmmaker this time. Another silence, longer this time. When Harris spoke again, his voice was cold. I never taught you to manhandle teenage girls walking home from the library. Don't act like you're better than me, Blackwood snapped. I've got footage of you doing worse. Remember that kid from the east side last year? Is that a threat, Jim? Harris's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. It's a reminder that we're in this together. You vouched for me for years. You signed off on every complaint. You helped me move up the ranks. If I go down, you're coming with me. The line went dead. Blackwood stared at his phone in disbelief. Had his mentor just hung up on him? Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds had made a decision of her own. After leaving Wong's office, she drove across town to a quiet apartment complex. She sat in her car for several minutes, gathering her courage, before finally getting out and knocking on a door. The woman who answered looked tired, as if she hadn't slept in days. Officer Reynolds recognized her immediately from the news. Mrs. Johnson, Letitia's mother. Mrs. Johnson, I'm Officer Reynolds with Internal Affairs. I apologize for the late hour, but I need to speak with you and your daughter. It's important. Mrs. Johnson eyed the officer's uniform warily. My daughter's been through enough with the police. I understand. That's why I'm here. Reynolds lowered her voice. We found evidence that what happened to Letitia wasn't an isolated incident. There's more you need to know, things that could help your case. After a moment's hesitation, Mrs. Johnson opened the door wider. Inside, Letitia sat at the kitchen table, a textbook open in front of her. Despite everything, she was trying to keep up with her schoolwork. This officer says she has information for us, her mother explained. Letitia looked up, her eyes guarded. What kind of information? Reynolds took a deep breath. The kind that could change everything. We found videos, lots of them. Officer Blackwood has been doing this for years, and his supervisor helped cover it up. She set her department-issued tablet on the table. I'm not supposed to show these to anyone outside the investigation, but I think you deserve to see them. You deserve to know you're not alone. As they watched the videos together, tears welled in Letitia's eyes. Not from fear or sadness this time, but from a strange sense of relief. It wasn't just her. She hadn't done anything to provoke what happened. There are at least 12 other victims we've identified so far, Reynolds explained. Most of them never filed reports because they didn't think anyone would believe them. What happens now? Mrs. Johnson asked. Tomorrow morning, Lieutenant Wong is presenting all of this to Chief Rodriguez. After that, Reynolds shrugged. It's up to the chief and the district attorney. Letitia closed the tablet, unable to watch any more. Will those other people, the ones in the videos, will they know they weren't alone either? Reynolds nodded. We're going to contact each of them. Your case broke the dam, Letitia. Now everything's coming out. As Officer Reynolds left the Johnson apartment, her phone buzzed with a text from Lieutenant Wong. Harris just called. Wants to talk. Says he has information on Blackwood. Meeting him at headquarters, 7 a.m. The blue wall of silence was beginning to crumble. At 6:45 the next morning, Chief Rodriguez arrived at her office to find Lieutenant Wong waiting with a box of files and a hard drive. We have everything we need, he told her without preamble. And Harris is turning on Blackwood. He's on his way in now. The chief's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of her surprise. Show me. As they reviewed the evidence together, one thing became abundantly clear. Officer James Blackwood wouldn't just be losing his job. He would likely be losing his freedom. The morning sun had barely risen when 3 police cars pulled up outside Officer Blackwood's house. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as officers in tactical gear positioned themselves around the property. This wasn't a courtesy call between colleagues. This was an arrest. Lieutenant Wong stood by his vehicle, radio in hand. All units in position. A chorus of confirmations came through. Wong nodded to Chief Rodriguez, who had insisted on being present. This was too important, too symbolic, to delegate. Let's do this by the book, she said quietly. No mistakes. Wong approached the front door, 2 officers at his side. He knocked firmly. Police, open up. Inside, Blackwood jerked awake at the sound. For a moment, he was confused. Why would police be at his door? Then reality crashed over him like a wave. His wife sat up beside him, fear in her eyes. Jim, what's happening? Blackwood's mouth went dry. He'd spent the night drinking after Harris hung up on him, trying to drown the growing certainty that his career was over. But in his darkest thoughts, he hadn't imagined this. Stay here, he told his wife, pulling on a t-shirt and sweatpants. The knocking came again, louder. Police, we have a warrant for James Blackwood's arrest. His wife's face drained of color. Arrest? Jim, what did you do? He didn't answer, couldn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door on legs that felt like they might give way beneath him. When he opened it, he found himself staring into Lieutenant Wong's impassive face. Officer James Blackwood, Wong said formally, you are under arrest for assault, false imprisonment, civil rights violations, and official misconduct. You have the right to remain silent. Blackwood barely heard the rest of his rights being read. His eyes moved past Wom to the street, where news vans were already setting up. Cameras pointed at him like accusing fingers. How had they known to be here? As one handcuffed him, Blackwood felt a surreal detachment, as if this was happening to someone else. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The department protected its own. The blue wall of silence wasn't supposed to crack like this. "My service weapon is in the safe," he said mechanically as they led him toward the police car. It was the cop in him speaking, following procedure even now. His wife appeared in the doorway, clutching her robe around herself. "Should I call a lawyer?" she called out, her voice breaking. Blackwood could only nod as he was guided into the back seat of the car, a place he'd put countless others but never imagined sitting himself. Across town, Letitia and her mother watched the arrest live on television. The news had woken them with an urgent call, "Turn on your TV now." They sat together on their small couch, hands clasped tightly as the cameras showed Blackwood being led away in handcuffs. "I never thought," Mrs. Johnson whispered, unable to finish the sentence. Letitia felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction, yes, at seeing justice begin to work. But there was also a strange sadness for the officer's family, for all the lives now changed forever, including her own. "It's not over yet," she reminded her mother. "This is just the arrest. There's still the trial." Her phone buzzed with a text from Attorney Chen. "Turn on the news. Call me when you can. This changes our strategy." At the police station, the processing of Officer Blackwood proceeded with unusual formality. Officers who had worked alongside him for years now avoided eye contact as they took his fingerprints, his mugshot, catalogued his personal items. In an interview room, Harris sat with the district attorney and Chief Rodriguez, finalizing the deal he'd struck: immunity from prosecution in exchange for his complete testimony against Blackwood and his cooperation with the broader investigation into departmental practices. "I want to be clear," the DA said, tapping his pen against the table. "You're admitting to helping cover up multiple incidents of misconduct over a period of years." Harris nodded, his face gray and drawn. "Yes. I signed off on incident reports that I knew contained false information. I helped reclassify complaints to make them appear less serious. I advised Blackwood on ways to avoid scrutiny." "Why?" Chief Rodriguez asked, the one-word question heavy with meaning. Harris stared at his hands. "At first, I thought I was mentoring a promising officer who was just a bit overzealous. By the time I realized how far over the line he'd gone, I was already complicit. It was easier to keep covering for him than admit what I'd done." The chief's expression hardened. "Easier for her. 3 years can change a lot." The trees outside the Riverside County Courthouse had grown taller. Downtown had a new coffee shop where lawyers and clients huddled over paperwork. And Letitia Johnson, once a frightened high school student, now walked with the confident stride of a college sophomore. She paused at the courthouse steps, taking a deep breath. Today was important, not just for her, but for the entire city. "You ready for this?" her mother asked, squeezing her hand. Letitia nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Inside, the community room was packed. City officials sat in a neat row behind a long table. Reporters lined the walls. In the front row, Mrs. Rivera, the retired judge who had first stepped in to help Letitia, saved them seats. "There she is," Mrs. Rivera said warmly as they approached, "the woman of the hour." Letitia smiled, still not used to being called a woman rather than a girl. But at 20, with 2 years of pre-law studies behind her, she was definitely not the same person who had been handcuffed on a suburban street 3 years ago. Chief Rodriguez stood at the podium, addressing the gathered crowd. "Today marks the official implementation of the Johnson Accountability Protocols in the Riverside Police Department. These reforms represent the most significant changes to our policies and training in the department's history." Letitia felt her throat tighten with emotion. The protocols bore her name, a reminder that sometimes terrible things could lead to positive change. "Before I explain the specifics," the chief continued, "I want to acknowledge the courage of the young woman who made all this possible." Letitia Johnson could have simply tried to put her experience behind her. Instead, she channeled her pain into purpose. The room erupted in applause as Letitia was invited to join the chief at the podium. As she stood to make her way forward, she caught sight of Lieutenant Wong, now Captain Wong, nodding respectfully from his seat with the department brass. At the microphone, Letitia unfolded her prepared remarks, then set them aside. She wanted to speak from the heart. 3 years ago, I was walking home from my job at the library when an officer stopped me for no reason. He handcuffed me, humiliated me, and made me feel like I wasn't human. Her voice was steady, confident. What happened next changed my life in ways I never expected. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the community members who had supported her journey. Officer Blackwood is now serving a 5-year sentence. His supervisor received 3 years probation. 4 other officers were fired. But this isn't about punishment. It's about building something better. The Johnson accountability protocols were comprehensive. Body cameras that couldn't be turned off during encounters, a civilian review board with real power, mandatory reporting of witnessed misconduct, training on implicit bias, and community service requirements for every officer. Most importantly, Letitia continued, every complaint will be tracked in a transparent system. No more hiding problems until they become too big to ignore. In the back of the room, Officer Reynolds, now Lieutenant Reynolds and Head of Community Relations, watched with pride. Her decision to bring evidence directly to Letitia and her mother had cost her some friendships within the department, but had earned her something more valuable, respect. After the ceremony, people gathered in small groups discussing the changes. Letitia found herself approached by a young police cadet, barely older than she was. "Miss Johnson," he said nervously, "I just wanted to say thank you. I joined the academy because I want to help people, not hurt them. These new protocols, they're why I feel okay about wearing the uniform." Letitia smiled. "What's your name?" "Tyler," he said. "I'll be graduating next month." "Well, Officer Tyler, maybe you can come speak to my criminal justice class sometime. My professor is always looking for officers who understand what good policing really means." Outside the courthouse, Mrs. Rivera, Letitia, and Mrs. Johnson walked together toward the parking lot. "So," Mrs. Rivera asked, "have you heard from any of those law schools you apply to?" Letitia grinned. "Georgetown sent an acceptance letter yesterday, and NYU wants an interview next week." "They'd be lucky to have you," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice thick with pride. "Any school would." As they reached Mrs. Rivera's car, the older woman turned to Letitia. "You know, when I saw what was happening to you that day, I just did what anyone should do. I never imagined it would lead to all this." "That's the thing," Letitia replied thoughtfully. "None of us ever knows what our actions might lead to. Officer Blackwood never imagined that stopping one girl would end his career. You never imagined that helping one stranger would transform the police department. And I never imagined that the worst day of my life would eventually help make things better for so many people." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Captain Wong exited the courthouse with Chief Rodriguez. The 2 officers waved in their direction. "It's not perfect," Mrs. Rivera acknowledged. "There's still so much work to do." "There always will be," Letitia agreed. "But now I know something I didn't know before." "What's that?" her mother asked. Letitia smiled, the confidence of hard-won wisdom in her eyes. "I know that when enough good people decide to do the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs them something, that's when real change happens." As they drove away from the courthouse, Letitia caught a glimpse of the building where her journey had begun, the library where she had worked as a teenager. It was still there, still full of books about law and justice and history. But now she understood those concepts in ways no book could ever teach. Sometimes life's hardest lessons became its most valuable gifts. And sometimes one person's story could help write a better ending for an entire community.